If you've heard anything about the First Crusade, you've probably heard that it was an attempt by Western knights to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims. But what you probably haven't heard is that this entire expedition nearly ended in complete failure in a massive siege hundreds of miles away from the city of Jerusalem itself. There is perhaps no battle that came so close to ending the entire project of the First Crusade as the siege of Antioch. Taking this city meant multiple encounters with different enemy armies, each one of which could have spelled the end for the entire crusading army. This story has treachery, suffering, savagery, even cannibalism, and an enormous amount of faith and courage. Now, in choosing this battle to focus on in this episode, I am of necessity passing over some others. It would be impossible to give you a battle-by-battle account of the entire First Crusade in a single podcast, so I'm not going to do that. I have chosen the Siege of Antioch in particular because it is so epic in scale, and also because it's so representative of the qualities and problems that characterized the entire First Crusade. I'm also, of necessity, going to focus on one particular crusade leader, although there were several of them. But this episode is largely going to feature one of my favorites, a guy called Bohemond the Norman, and he comes from southern Italy. So we're going to see Bohemond feature in many of the engagements and the battles in today's story because perhaps more than any other, he emerged from the First Crusade with a reputation that was synonymous with everything that Western knights aspired to on this expedition. So you're going to find out the reasons for that, as well as what he did with it. You're listening to Villains and Virgins podcast. And before we get into all the juicy details of today's episode on the First Crusade, I want to pause and say a note of thanks to those people who are part of the Villains and Virgins podcast community. They are supporters on Patreon. And a special note of thanks is due to the following individuals who are supporting the podcast at the very highest level. They are Richard Hubner, Kenneth Jones, Tim Williams, Anthony Farnbach, Rick Kane, Gordon Carl, and Agnes Weiner. And if you're interested in access to even more history content, including live conversations after each new episode, additional stories that come up during research, you can head over to patreon.com/Eva Schubert and check it out. So in the previous episode on the First Crusade, I talked about the motivations that caused so many thousands of Europeans to make this incredibly long and incredibly dangerous journey from Western Europe into Turkey and eventually, at least they aspired to go, to Jerusalem itself. And there were two movements that are happening at the same time under the banner of what we call the First Crusade. The People's Crusade is the name that historians give to the first Westerners who arrived in Constantinople aspiring to be crusaders. And these were led by a guy called Peter the Hermit, an itinerant preacher who had spread the word of the crusade not just in France, but across large parts of modern Germany as well. And he was so successful that he managed to attract, by some estimates, nearly 40,000 people to make this journey. But Peter the Hermit wasn't really big on logistics and planning, so he didn't mention that fighting ability was really important for this project, or that there was an actually agreed departure date that had been coordinated between the Pope in Western Europe, who had initially spread the call for a crusade, and instigated Peter the Hermit and many other preachers to take up that call and spread it, and the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, a guy called Alexius Comnenus, whose letter to the Pope requesting Western military help had been the impetus for the entire First Crusade. So the Pope in Western Europe and the emperor in the Eastern Roman Empire, with his capital in Constantinople, have together agreed on this plan, and they've agreed for a start date when they want people to arrive in Constantinople to begin this expedition. But Peter the Hermit, in the spreading of the word that he did in his sermons across France and Germany, neglected a lot of these details. The result of that was that we saw the People's Crusade, this ragtag bunch of people, including women and families and churchmen and the elderly, a couple of knights, a whole lot of peasants, and other people from the middle classes who show up in a very disorderly way without any clear leadership and basically cause chaos. And as we saw, they're vandalizing, they kill thousands of Jews across Germany as they make their way down towards Turkey. Nothing but trouble follows the People's Crusade, and that trouble continues when they arrive in Constantinople itself. The emperor sends them to a camp outside the city. He gives them very clear instructions to stay in the camp because they're very close to territory that's now under Turkish control. But these guys, they're not really big on following orders. They don't have any sense of leadership, and they quickly set out into Turkish territory and meet disaster. The result of that is that the vast majority of the 40,000 or so people who come to Constantinople on the People's Crusade are either killed or they're enslaved and taken away as a result of this sort of behavior. So a quest that had motivated so many thousands of Europeans, the ones who arrived in the People's Crusade, ended long before they got anywhere close to Jerusalem. Peter the Hermit himself explained the failure of the People's Crusade by saying, well, a lot of these people were lawless brigands, and it was due to the impurity of their hearts, the sin in their lives, that God did not allow them to see Jerusalem. But other contemporary observers at the time explained that the disaster of the People's Crusade was caused by very different factors. One of them remarked that death comes to meet the undisciplined, and the man who cannot control himself does not survive for long. And this cautionary note is a good one to keep in mind as we get into the events that are going to unfold for the second wave of Crusaders. They begin arriving just about the time that the People's Crusade has wrapped up in disaster. The second wave comes in. So who are the second wave? These are people that historians call the Prince's Crusade. And these are the ones that the Pope in Western Europe and the Emperor in the Eastern Roman Empire were hoping to have arrive. The Prince's Crusade had a very large number of knights, nobles, experienced men-at-arms. These people were seasoned fighters, and they were exactly the ones that Emperor Alexius Comnenus was hoping would permit him to retake sections of the Eastern Roman Empire that had been lost to the Turks, including Jerusalem itself. So when the Prince's Crusaders arrive, they don't all arrive at once. They leave Europe at the appointed start time, which is in the middle of August 1096, and so they start actually arriving in Constantinople, the very first ones, by late October of 1096. And they continue coming in different divisions and groups all the way into the spring of 1097, because depending on where you started in Western Europe, it was going to take you longer to reach Constantinople. And other factors are whether you traveled by land or whether you came down to Italy and took a boat across. So they're arriving at different times, but they're mostly arriving under the leadership of different nobles. So, for example, Bohemond, the Norman, arrives with a contingent of other Norman knights from southern Italy. So these guys are following him. He's the leader of his own sort of mini group. And we see similar formations. A very high-ranking noble by the name of Raymond of Toulouse comes from southern France. And he brings a large number of knights and fighters from that region, and they're very much under his guidance. But critically, while there are multiple contingents of this kind from different parts of Europe, each with their own highest-ranking noble as leader, there isn't one overall leader of the entire Crusader army. And this is going to be a critical factor. The Crusaders sort of assume that Emperor Alexius Comnenus is going to fill that role. After all, he's the one who's invited them in. It is his mission that this army has come to fulfill, and when they've arrived, he's actually required all of the highest-ranking nobles who are leading these divisions to swear an oath of fealty to him. Now, as we discussed last time, an oath of fealty is basically an oath of loyalty that a knight would take to his overlord, saying, "You're the ruler, I'm your loyal servant, I fight on your behalf, I'm going to be loyal to you, and in exchange I'm going to receive honors or payment or perhaps land in response." But land was the critical thing. In this particular scenario, the reason why the emperor wanted the nobles to swear oaths to him was because he wanted to ensure that any land that they recaptured from the control of the Turks would be turned over to him. What he was worried about was that these acquisitive, ambitious, militarily successful Western fighters would be trying to carve out their own little kingdoms or their own chunks of land. So it wasn't much good to the emperor if these knights took cities from the Turks only to keep them for themselves. Then the emperor wouldn't end up in any kind of an improved situation. He would have just substituted one problem for another. So the emperor is very keen that all of the leaders of these Crusader divisions make this oath. It's an honor thing, and it's going to provide assurance that whatever land they take reverts to his control. Now, there are a few interesting details we need to absorb here. Emperor Alexius Comnenus was a Christian, but he would have been described as an Eastern Christian. You might have called him a Greek Christian or an Orthodox Christian. He was part of the Eastern Christian tradition. The Crusaders who arrived from Western Europe are Latin Christians. They come from the Western European Christian tradition. So Latin Christians regard the Pope as their highest spiritual authority at this time. There was no such thing as Protestant Christianity. Only Catholic or Latin Christianity exists in 1096 in Western Europe. But in Eastern Europe, there's an Eastern version of Christianity which doesn't recognize the Pope as its leader and has a different system of sort of church authority and deciding what are the issues of doctrine and how do we practice. So this division had really happened formally in 1054. And so the emperor's on the eastern side. He's an Eastern Christian. The Western Crusaders are Latin or Catholic Christians. Part of the call of crusade that's motivated these guys to come to Constantinople is they've been hearing stories of the atrocities that Turkish Muslims are committing against Eastern Christians. They've heard stories of churches being demolished or otherwise damaged. We've heard stories about Christian communities suffering physical violence, rape, enslavement, and so on. And so the call to rescue your Eastern Christian brothers from the oppression of the Muslim Turk was definitely a significant part of the crusading message that has brought many of these knights here. However, nobody goes to war for just one reason, and to imagine that all crusaders are sort of altruistically motivated by the desire to liberate Eastern Christians would be ridiculous. If you think about any time you've ever seen a war in history, whether we're looking at a contemporary one or one that happened 1,000 years ago, there are messages that are used to pitch the war, and then there are the reasons the war is actually fought. And some of those are going to include personal ambition, a desire for wealth, and a bunch of other mixed motivations that will emerge as these knights hit the road and begin to undertake this military expedition. When the Prince's Crusade had finally all filed into Constantinople, we have estimates that put their numbers between 40 and 50,000. So that's a very significant number of fighting men. And in exchange for the oaths of loyalty that the nobles are going to swear to the emperor, he promises to provide them with food, with intelligence, with guidance. So it's a mutual system of obligations. He's going to take care of this Western army that is now in his lands, and they are going to serve his interests in terms of reclaiming his territory and stabilizing the Eastern Roman Empire. You might recall from our last episode that some of these Crusader nobles made Emperor Alexius Comnenus a bit anxious. In particular, our man Bohemond the Norman. And this is because Bohemond and his father, Robert Guiscard, who we've talked about in an entire podcast series on the Normans in Italy, actually made war on the Eastern Roman Empire themselves relatively recently, within the last 10 to 15 years. And so Bohemond had actually been leading armies against Emperor Alexius Comnenus' side. So now this former enemy of the Eastern Roman Empire is coming ostensibly to fight on its behalf. But you could forgive the emperor for wondering what other agendas Bohemond might be harboring. And Bohemond did actually insist on a personal deal with the emperor before he swore the oath of fealty. He said, well, if I take some territory that didn't belong to your empire, if I, in other words, take some other territory from the Turks that didn't belong to you, I'm going to keep that for myself. And if you're willing to sign on to that deal, then I'll promise that any of your territory that I recapture, I'll return to you. So Bohemond makes this promise. And I want to underline that for you because he's going to be singing a very different tune as our story unfolds. So remember that he does swear to return imperial land to the emperor. And significantly, another one of the nobles, Raymond of Toulouse from southern France, delays a long time. He doesn't want to make this promise, not because he thinks that he wants to keep land for himself necessarily, but because he thinks it's beneath his dignity. He's the guy that other people swear fealty to. In his land, he doesn't like being in the position of swearing fealty to someone else as his overlord. And Raymond of Toulouse also finally swears the oath, after some thinly veiled threats by Bohemond, who's getting impatient and wants the crusade to get underway and is tired of Raymond of Toulouse holding things up, because nobody can leave Constantinople until the emperor is happy, the deal is done, and everyone's responsibilities are clear. Finally, with these oaths taken and the agreements formalized, the crusade can finally begin in the spring of 1097. Now, the Crusaders had assumed that the emperor himself would lead the expedition, and that he would assume sort of supreme command, to be the general in charge of everything. But remember, Emperor Alexius Comnenus had taken the very drastic step of inviting a Western army into the Eastern Roman Empire because he was really in trouble. His empire was falling apart. He was unable to maintain its borders against incursions not just from the Turks, but from other problematic groups. And his own hold on power inside the palace was now tenuous. They had lost faith in his leadership. They were saying the empire was falling apart, which wasn't inaccurate. And so there had already been several attempted coups to overthrow the emperor and replace him with somebody else. Under these circumstances, Emperor Alexius Comnenus was understandably rather reluctant to journey any distance from Constantinople. He needed to stay close to his capital and keep an eye on things in there for fear that if he was any distance away, he might be unseated. However, he did provide the Crusaders with imperial military officers and troops who would march alongside them and would provide them with information about the terrain, where they were going, and intelligence on the enemies they were going to face. Now, there were about 2,000 kilometers between Constantinople and Jerusalem. It's a very long distance, and it's sort of a curving route along the eastern side of the Mediterranean. And before you can go to Jerusalem, there are a lot of other cities along the way that need to be taken, strategic cities that are now in the hands of the Turks. If the Crusaders had just gone past those cities, well, first of all, they wouldn't really have done the job of stabilizing the Eastern Roman Empire. But secondly, they would have exposed themselves to attack because those cities, in the hands of their enemies, could be used as staging points to send armies against them from behind. So they couldn't just proceed directly from Constantinople to Jerusalem. And besides, while Jerusalem was a big selling point in the call to crusade, it was not the largest priority for the emperor. It was one of a list of many cities that he wanted to regain from Turkish control. So he gave this list of cities to the crusading army, and they begin to commence this long curving route, and there are quite a number of towns and cities they're going to have to take before they get anywhere close to Jerusalem itself. By the early summer of 1097, the crusading army is advancing towards one of the major cities on the list that the emperor has given them, a place called Nicaea. Now, you will know it as Nicaea, and you'll have heard about Nicaea and the Nicene Creed. You might have heard about it in the New Testament of the Bible. It's a very, very old city, and it had been under the control of the Eastern Roman Empire until relatively recently. But the correct pronunciation, and the one that they would have used at the time, was Nicaea. So think of it with a K, not a C. When the Crusaders arrived outside the city, they found it very well fortified with high, thick walls. So the population inside is very much protected by this external physical barrier, and it's going to require a siege in order to take the city. Nicaea is now under the control of the Seljuk Turks, who are going to be the enemy for the remainder of this story. So far, I've been speaking of the Seljuk Turks as one group. Now, where do they come from? They are a nomadic horse tribe that comes out of the Central Eurasian steppe. So they're extremely good on their horses, they're excellent fighters, they've swept down from the east to the west, following a well-carved tradition of other warrior tribes coming from the steppe and heading west. And they've been very successful at sweeping through cities in their path and taking control of large chunks of territory. So the Seljuk Turks are building an empire. These Turks are not the Ottomans, okay? The Ottomans come later. So when we're talking about the Turks in this story, and I'm going to use the term Turks because it's more familiar to most people, we are referring to this much earlier tribe, the Seljuk Turks. Now, the Seljuks are great fighters, but they're also very competitive amongst themselves. So they've been very successful at controlling large chunks of territory as part of their new Seljuk Empire. But inside that empire, different warlords or chieftains are carving out their own little fiefdoms or zones of control. And the Seljuks call these guys emirs. Now, emir is just an Arab word that means leader or commander. So it doesn't have any religious significance, it has military significance. So you have a bunch of these Seljuk emirs, each with their own fiefdoms or territories, and they're often fighting amongst themselves because each of these guys wants to expand his own sphere of control at the expense of others. The Seljuk Turks are Muslims, yes. Are they the entire Muslim world? No. There are lots of other Muslims who are not Seljuk Turks and who regard their interests as perhaps different. For example, the Fatimids are a Muslim dynasty that at this time controls Cairo in Egypt. They're not Turkish, and they are Shi'i Muslims. The Seljuk Turks are Sunni Muslims, and Sunnis are the majority Muslim group in the Muslim world. The Shia are a minority group. So Shia Muslims in Egypt are nothing to do with the Seljuk Turk Sunni Muslims in this story, who are going to be the people the Crusaders are clashing with militarily most of the time. When I'm talking about the Turks and the Turkish army, that doesn't mean that everybody in that army is ethnically Seljuk Turk. Because the minute you have an empire, the minute you have a group of people that start controlling a very large range of territory, it means that there are many other people from different ethnic groups who are now subject to their control. So when a Turkish army comes out to fight the Crusaders, it means an army that is under the command of the Seljuk Turks. But that army could be composed of many different people, including Arabs, including Kurds, including perhaps even some Persians, as well as Turkish warriors. So I will, for simplicity's sake, talk about the Turks and the Turkish army, but I want you to understand that it's a more complicated picture than just that. And the Crusaders themselves would have had a very one-dimensional view of their opponents here. They would have just called them the Saracens, which is kind of the medieval Christian word for the Muslims. So they would have said that the Saracens, the pagans, the infidels, the enemy. Similarly, Muslim sources at this time, whether they were Seljuk Turkish or whether they were Fatimid Egyptian, would be talking about these foreigners as sort of the Franj, which was their word for the Franks, the Westerners, the Franks, the Christians. Even though the Western army wasn't just Franks. We have Normans from southern Italy, we have people from France, southern France, northern France, parts of Germany, even Armenians. So it's a very, very mixed group on both sides. It's a little more complicated than just saying, these are all Christians and these are all Muslims, and they're all fighting strictly for religious reasons. So by the time the Crusaders are beginning their march out of Constantinople in the early summer of 1097, the Seljuks are occupied amongst themselves. They know that the Eastern Roman Empire is weak, that it's tottering, and they're much more concerned about dividing the lands they've already conquered amongst themselves. The Eastern Roman Emperor has had to rely on mercenaries for quite some time in order to meet his military needs. He's even used Seljuk Turkish warriors as mercenaries fighting his battles. He's hired Frankish and Norman mercenaries before in smaller numbers to fight in his armies. So in many ways, bringing in this Crusader army is just a bigger and better version of a strategy that the Eastern Roman Emperor has pursued for quite some time. The Seljuk Turks were nominally under the control of their Sultan, the highest ranking of all of their chieftains or emirs. He was a guy called Kilij Arslan. But by the time the Crusaders are rolling in, Kilij Arslan is still in his late teens. He's got a very weak grip on control of the massive Seljuk Empire, and he's spending most of his time fighting other Seljuk emirs who had stolen land from his own father. So he's busy fighting other Seljuk guys at the time that the Crusaders begin their march. Interestingly enough, the city of Nicaea is actually the capital city for this Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan. And this is the city the Crusaders are about to surround and put under siege. But the Sultan is not there. He's out on a military campaign fighting another Seljuk emir. Of course, Nicaea is not just full of Turks. Remember, this is a city that previously belonged to the Eastern Roman Empire, and so you had Greek, Syrian, Armenian Christians in there as well, along with a new Turkish population. So it's a mixed city, but it's under Turkish control. Both the emperor and the Turkish rulers of Nicaea regarded its fortifications as so strong that it was invulnerable to anything but a long siege that would starve out the population. They thought that the fortifications themselves were too tall and too strong to be scaled or destroyed for a forced entry into the city. The Crusaders, on the other hand, thought otherwise. And many of these Western knights had been busy refining the art of siege warfare. So they got right to work as soon as they had encircled the city itself with their lines of men and made camp around it. They get straight to work building siege machines. And if you've watched any kind of medieval films about this period, you'll know that there were these towers, these sort of structures on wheels that they constructed to roll up next to the walls of the city, which would allow invaders to climb the siege tower and to launch an attack from the same level as the wall. So the Crusaders are busy building exactly these kinds of materials and implements because they think they can force their way in. Now, of course, the Turkish defenders of the city weren't just sitting passively on the walls watching all this happen. They were actively trying to deter any attempt to get close to that wall or to climb it. And they would do this by firing arrows at knights or fighters who got too close to the wall, whether they were at ground level or whether they were working on a tower. And they would also do things like pouring vats of boiling pitch or grease or oil onto the heads of anyone who got too close to the wall, which is a horrifying thing to suffer. I mean, to have your skin essentially burned off your body and to die screaming in agony. This is not the sort of death that you would imagine when you think about a siege, but it's certainly something that happened to people who got, unfortunately, too close in the wrong place at the wrong time. You were vulnerable to these kinds of assaults. Then there was the psychological warfare component, which is always present in siege warfare. Basically, the game is that the attacking army surrounds the city, and their whole game is to say, you want to surrender as soon as possible. Because the longer that you hold out and defend the city and refuse to let us in, the worse it's going to be for you. So typically when an attacking army rolled up, they would make some kind of offer, like surrender right now, and this is the deal you're going to get. But the longer the siege goes on, the longer you make us wait, the more expensive and difficult that this is for us, as the attacking army, the more horrendous it's going to be for you when we get inside. For the defenders of the city, there was a reverse game that they were playing, and they were saying basically, you're not going to get in here, we're going to kill you all, give up now and go away. And so this would go on in many cases for months. And one of the tactics that we see employed in the siege of Nicaea is this incredibly visual moment. So a Western knight gets too close to the wall and he's killed, probably by an arrow. So he collapses, he dies. The defenders of Nicaea lower over the wall some kind of a metal claw device. And when I was reading about this, the only image that came to my mind was a kind of machine that you used to find in sort of arcades where you could put a coin in and a metal claw would descend from the center of the box and you could grab some sort of, plush animal or toy or something from the bottom and you would pull it up with the claw and that's what you got for your money. It seems like a device like this was employed by the defenders of Nicaea. They lower down a metal claw over the walls of the city. They pick up the corpse of this dead knight. They pull it back up over the walls and out of sight. And sometime later, the corpse of that dead crusader knight reemerges. But this time it's stripped naked and it's hanging from a noose. And so they lower his naked corpse hanging from a rope back over the wall and they leave it dangling there in full view of the crusading army that surrounds the city. Now, this kind of an action is obviously intended as a taunt and also as a threat. Now, the Crusaders responded in kind. When they encountered a group of Turkish soldiers that were riding into the city to try and provide assistance to their brethren inside Nicaea, the Crusaders kill these guys, they decapitate them, they stick their heads on pikes or spears, and they parade these severed heads on these spears up and down in front of the walls in full view of the defenders of the city. And this is sort of the return. It's saying, this is what we will do to you if you don't surrender. So these sort of, I hesitate to call them games, but these sort of taunts are a very standard feature of medieval siege warfare. Now, while all this is going on, Emperor Alexius Comnenus is sending secret messages to the governor of Nicaea. The crusading army doesn't know about this, but the emperor is saying to them, listen, you better make terms with me right now. You better surrender, because if these foreigners get into your city, what they do, I cannot answer for. So make terms with me right now, and we can make a deal so that none of you have to die in horrifying ways. Perhaps none of you have to die at all. We can just have a peaceful handover. So the emperor is sending these diplomatic messages. But initially, the defenders of Nicaea ignore them. They're fairly confident in their ability to hold this city, and they think that eventually there is going to be a Turkish army that's going to ride up from the outside, very likely, and provide assistance. So they just have to sit it out for a while until those guys arrive, and they've got a very strong set of fortifications to wait it out behind. But the Norman knights in particular, from southern Italy, led by Bohemond, have a lot of experience breaking into fortified cities. This has sort of been what they've been doing for the last several years back in southern Italy. So they're very good at this. They've refined some of their tactics and techniques, and they think they've got a good shot here. The Normans soon weaken critical parts of the wall, and this becomes obvious to the defenders, and it begins to shake their confidence. If these guys are able to put cracks in the fortifications and to begin to break into some of the exterior towers, then maybe it is only a matter of time. To make matters worse, the emperor then sends messages to the inhabitants of Nicaea saying, I'm going to send more imperial troops to strengthen this crusading army. The odds against you are mounting. You better make terms with me while you still can. As a result of all this, the Turkish rulers of Nicaea surrendered the city to the emperor in a private deal that they signed with his representatives in June of 1097. So once again, the Crusaders don't know that this diplomacy is going on. Emperor Alexius Comnenus is using them, their military effectiveness and the threat of violence that they represent, to achieve his own diplomatic goals, which is just to get the city back. So the Turks sign a deal. The emperor gets some of his own troops into the city. They're sort of let in on the sly, and to put the imperial banners up there to say, okay, the city's been taken. It's under imperial control. There's nothing for the Crusaders to do here. It's done. So this recapture of Nicaea is a major diplomatic victory for the emperor. It sort of vindicates his decision to call in this Western army and shows that he made the right call. He's addressing the Turkish problem. Here are measurable gains that are happening right now. Nicaea is back in imperial hands. And the Crusaders regard this as sort of perhaps a sign of divine approval. The city has been taken. There were very few casualties on their side. So this is a good thing for them as well. They can move on. Undoubtedly, though, there were some of them who were unhappy at the thought that they didn't get to sack the city. So sacking of cities is something that we see going on in all the centuries that we have siege warfare and fortified cities. It goes on in the High Middle Ages, but it's going on even in the 1500s and 1600s. It's a well-established tradition that the invading army, when they manage to force their way into a city, will sack it. What does it mean? Well, a sack sounds like an improvised bag that you put things in, and that's not a bad image. You can think of roving bands of soldiers coming through a city and basically seizing and taking anything valuable that they could carry away with them. So it's massive theft of whatever can be carried away that's valuable, but it's usually accompanied by sickening levels of violence. Obviously, things have to be taken from the people who own them, and that usually involves beating and killing of those people who own the things. And not just because you want to take the things. There's a good deal of killing, even rape and torture, that is done sort of for its own sake, as a sort of revenge, as a sort of payback for the army being stuck outside the walls for months on end. So sacking a city is very much the reward for the invading army. And this is a reward that is denied the Crusaders at this moment. So yes, it's great that we didn't have a lot of casualties. It seems like a good sign that God is approving of our mission, but there were definitely people there who were unhappy about the lack of sacking. However, this is just the first major city. The Crusaders are going to have to march on toward the next ones on the emperor's checklist, and that's exactly what they do. So in the months that followed, the combined forces of the Western Crusading Knights and some imperial troops under the command of an imperial general are marching together along this route, along the edge of the eastern Mediterranean, and they go past a number of other towns and cities that are under Turkish control, which very, very quickly relinquish their authority. They hand themselves back over to the emperor, and so there's not a lot of struggle or prolonged siege on this march. The next major city they're heading towards is Antioch. So as these cities are surrendering, the Turkish chieftain or emir who had been in command of these areas is forced to flee. He doesn't have the forces to deal with this combined enormous Western and imperial military force. So he runs away, and he's actually executed by his own superior when he goes back to Turkish-controlled territory. And the young sultan, Kilij Arslan, who had been off on his own military campaign against another ambitious Seljuk emir, decides that actually the time for infighting is over. We have to take this influx of Westerners seriously. This crusading army is obviously a significant military threat. It's a new player on the scene. And so we see him and other Turkish leaders regrouping and thinking about how they're now going to confront this new threat. Now, as this army is marching along the route, you need to remember that a ridiculous amount of food and water is required to feed an army, whether it's on the march or whether it's sitting in camp. We are talking about thousands of men and thousands of animals. So the caloric requirements per day are massive. And as a result of this, it was difficult to be able to provision such a large force in one place on a daily basis. So they decide that it's a better idea to break the army up into a few contingents and have them marching slightly at different paces from each other so they're not all in the same place at exactly the same time. So it's in this configuration that Bohemond, our southern Italian Norman leader, is leading his group of southern Italian Norman knights along the path, and they find themselves suddenly ambushed by Turkish soldiers. The reports say that Bohemond's group is only a few thousand, and they are ambushed by a much, much larger Turkish force. So they're taken by surprise, and this is their first real encounter in the field with Turkish fighters. Everything up to this point has been in a siege context, where the crusading armies are dealing with defenders that are behind city walls. So that changes the type of fighting that's going on, and there hadn't really been hand-to-hand fighting or sacking of cities. So it's very much dealing with people who are shooting arrows and dumping pitch at you, or who will swing a blade at you if you come too close, but there's a big stone wall. So it's a different type of fighting. Meeting Turkish soldiers in an open field where they were at their best and could execute the devastating tactics that they'd used to build an empire in so short an amount of time was a different proposition altogether. Eyewitnesses from the event, some of whom have written about their experiences during the Crusades, describe this encounter as absolutely terrifying. Bohemond, his cousin Tancred, and their Norman knights clustered together in their formation and managed to avoid being separated and cut to pieces by the Turkish warriors who are surrounding them and charging them at high speed on horseback. They managed to avoid annihilation by retreating to some terrain that offers them some protection and by maintaining very, very close lines. This allows them to defend each other to avoid being separated until reinforcements arrive from the next contingent of the army that's been marching a little ways behind them. When these reinforcements arrive, the Turks retreat, they leave, and the engagement is over. So Bohemond and his Norman knights survive because their friends arrive in the nick of time. But another factor that we have to look at in these kinds of engagements is military technology. One of the reasons that Bohemond and his men weren't dead before their friends showed up was their armor. Seljuk Turks, like many other nomadic steppe tribes, had a battlefield game that was very much based upon their incredible horsemanship skills and their ability to fire arrows with great accuracy at speed while riding their horses. So a standard tactic was for their forces to advance, and they would have their front rank of mounted archers that would charge at high speed toward the enemy, basically running along their length, shooting arrows very, very rapidly with great accuracy into enemy lines, and then leaving, basically running past the line and circling back behind their own lines, immediately to be succeeded by another wave of Turkish mounted archers who would charge the line, ride past it, circle back. And so there would be these waves, successive waves, of high-speed mounted archers who would be shooting arrows with devastating effect into the opposing lines. The usual effect of this is that men would start dropping dead. They would start dropping dead at different depths in the formation, and that's going to create chaos and disorder in the lines. You're no longer standing at the right distance from your comrades to be able to effectively shield them and defend them, because there's a dead guy over here, a dead guy over there, another one over there. Now you're stepping over bodies. There are bodies between you and the other guys you're supposed to be next to. So this wave upon wave of mounted archer attack is designed to soften up your enemy army's division and only then would the Turks move in and engage in hand-to-hand combat. So they rely heavily on this sort of superpower they have of being able to shoot at high speeds while galloping on horses. What the Turks discovered as they encounter these Western knights is that these enemies are not responding the way enemies normally do to this battle-tested tactic that they've used with so much success. So when we look at what knights of this period were wearing, they're wearing full metal jackets, essentially. So we're looking at helmets that are covering their heads and their faces. We're looking at heavy chainmail that's covering their torsos, their arms, often parts of their legs, and even their horses have protective gear that's covering parts of their faces and their bodies as well. The result of this is that they're much less vulnerable to Turkish arrows than other armies in this region at this period. This ambush is the first real military engagement with the Turkish army, and it left an impression on the Crusaders. For example, the author of the Gesta Francorum, who is someone who is embedded with the crusading army and writing about his experiences in the field, has this to say. He says, "Some knights wished the Turks were Christians, and said, 'The Turks have a saying that they are common stock with the Franks, and that no men except the Franks and themselves are naturally born to be knights.' This is true, and nobody can deny it, that if only they had stood firm in the faith of Christ and Christendom, you could not find stronger or braver or more skillful soldiers." So you can see that there's a grudging respect here that is in the eyes of these Western knights as they encounter the enemy for the first time. That you can't fault the bravery of these people. You can't fault the skill of these people. It's a shame that they have the wrong religion, but these are real soldiers. And it's interesting that the Crusaders themselves say this at that time. So after surviving this ambush, the Crusader army marches on past even more towns and cities without major mishap until they finally reach the city of Antioch. So Antioch is a major city, previously part of the Eastern Roman Empire, and it's close to 700 kilometers away from Jerusalem. The siege of Antioch begins in October 1097. And this particular battle, as I've sort of already hinted, is going to have massive consequences for the Crusaders. It's going to have a very long shadow, not just on the army themselves, but on the ultimate way that the entire crusade is going to play out. So we're going to spend some time looking at how this unfolds. So like Nicaea, Antioch is occupied by the Turks, and it is extremely well fortified. In fact, its fortifications are far stronger than those of Nicaea. They have a wall that's nearly 2 meters thick and 20 feet high. There are 360 defensive towers at different intervals along that wall in which men can be stationed to have an excellent view of the surroundings and to be able to shoot projectiles and arrows down from. Due to its length and also the mountainous terrain immediately around Antioch, the city and its wall was almost impossible to surround completely. So this is a very serious problem. If you want to put a city under siege, your siege is only going to be effective if you can control all the movement of any food in and any people out. So if you're not able to completely control the perimeter, then your siege is likely to be ineffective. So this is one of the challenges of the terrain of Antioch, is it's very difficult to get an army to completely encircle and seal the entire perimeter. Furthermore, there are 6 different gates on that wall. So 6 different entrances where people can go out, things can come in. So it's a very difficult area to secure for siege purposes. Furthermore, the Turkish occupiers inside the city were very confident that they could withstand a siege, partly because they had the capacity to grow some food inside their walls. So they must have had gardens or other areas where they could produce some of the food they would need to eat, which means even if you do succeed in mostly choking off the perimeter, people are going to be able to sustain themselves for much longer if they have access to food from inside the city itself, rather than having to rely on getting it through the walls. So the crusading army takes its place around the city walls, especially around the 6 gates, which are vulnerable points because it's not just about making sure that no food gets into Antioch, but through any one of these gates, you could have a bunch of Turkish soldiers come storming out to skirmish with the smaller section of crusaders around that part of the wall. So these are vulnerable areas for the attacking army as well. Now, when the crusaders initially arrive at Antioch, it's October, which is harvest time. So this means that the area around the city is full of food. There's food that's been harvested from the fields and orchards in the farms and communities around. There's plenty to eat. And the crusaders even remark on the abundance and how well they're eating when they arrive. But this situation is going to change with astonishing speed. So to explain why that happens, we need to do a little bit of number crunching here. Maintaining a single horse could require between 5 and 10 gallons of water daily and about 20 pounds of food. And many crusaders had more than one horse. This was pretty standard for a noble. He would bring not one but several war horses to a campaign. So you have to imagine that there are thousands of horses that need to be nourished and need to have water on a daily basis. And then, of course, there's the men. So if we're looking at 40 to 50,000 men here, for easy estimations, say 5 pounds of food a day per man, when you add all these numbers together, you're starting to look at estimates of something like 500,000 pounds of food a day. That is massive. So when the army arrives, it's fairly easy in the first few weeks to just confiscate food, to grab food, buy food, obtain food from the communities and towns around the city itself. But within a matter of weeks, they had picked these areas bare, which is creating a food shortage not just for the Crusader armies, but also for the communities around who have watched their crops and their food disappear at an astonishing rate. By the end of the year, so by the end of December 1097, the situation was dire. One source traveling with the Crusaders reported that starving people were eating beanstalks in the fields, thistles, herbs, dogs, and even rats. Some were so desperate that they boiled and ate animal hides and even the seeds of grain from animal manure. So what does that mean? It means you have desperate people picking through the manure of animals like horses, trying to find individual grains that haven't been digested, picking them out of that fecal matter, washing them off so that they can eat them. That's the level of desperation that we're witnessing for some of the Crusaders and for the people in the communities immediately around the city itself. Now, disease followed malnutrition, as it so often does. When people aren't eating enough, their immune systems weaken, and that means they're far more vulnerable to succumbing to bacteria and other pathogens that they encounter. So by some estimates, 1 in 5 of the Crusaders perish due to things like typhus and cholera, which begin to ravage the camp. So if that estimate is correct, 1 in 5, then we're looking at up to 10,000 men dead without even engaging in a battle. They're dead because of malnutrition and disease. So if you're beginning to think that the situation of Crusaders in late December of 1097 is looking pretty miserable, that's accurate. They're starving, they're sick, they've watched comrades die, and they're about to get some even worse news. The news comes that a Turkish army from Syria is on its way to relieve the defenders of Antioch. And it is in this dark hour of desperation that one of the heroes of the First Crusade emerges. It's none other than Bohemond, the Norman knight from southern Italy, who's going to emerge as the hero of Antioch. So let's back up and remind ourselves a little bit about who this guy is. This Norman warrior was the son of Robert Guiscard, a fighter who had already been incredibly effective at taking large chunks of southern Italy and Sicily itself. That's Robert Guiscard. Bohemond is his firstborn son. And Bohemond has been by his father's side for a great many of these military adventures. By 1097, Bohemond is about 43 years old, and by all accounts, he had inherited not only his father's daring, but also his physical features and imposing physique. Bohemond is described as a full head taller than most men of his generation. He towers over other men. He wears his pale blonde hair short cropped, which is kind of unusual. Many knights at the time wore their hair chin length or longer. He's clean shaven, not bearded, another thing that makes him stand out, and gifted with a pair of very light blue, piercing eyes. He's described as an imposing or an intimidating figure by pretty much everyone who meets him. Remember, he successfully intimidated Raymond of Toulouse, who was a fairly high-ranking noble and probably not accustomed to deferring to anybody. Anna Comnena, the daughter of Emperor Alexius Comnenus, who meets Bohemond when he arrives in Constantinople initially with the other members of the Prince's Crusade, describes him as follows. She says, "The sight of him inspired admiration. The mention of his name, terror. Even his laugh sounded like a threat to others." Anna and her father the emperor had good reason to be wary of this particular Norman. Bohemond and his father Robert Guiscard had mounted their own military campaign on imperial soil, and in 1071, about 20 years earlier, at the Battle of Dorylaeum, Bohemond himself had led a contingent of Normans that managed to defeat the emperor's elite Varangian guard. So when we say that Bohemond is an experienced and highly effective fighter, what you should understand is that he's been taking on really good soldiers for a very long time and frequently winning. Bohemond's father, Robert Guiscard, was at that time on a campaign whose eventual goal was Constantinople itself, and some people report that if Robert Guiscard hadn't died of a fever in the field, he might have seized the imperial crown for himself. So Bohemond comes from a long line of extremely ambitious and extremely effective fighters. And after that campaign, Bohemond had spent the ensuing decade in a civil war with his brother after his father's untimely death. His half-brother had inherited a lot of his father's territory, and Bohemond had been busy making war in southern Italy, trying to gain back territory that he thought should belong to him. So this man is a veteran. He's spent the last 20 years in basically continuous military campaigning. And it's this background that we have to understand which makes him so outstanding in the extreme conditions that the crusading army is going to suffer in the Antioch campaign. So at this moment, in late December, Bohemond and another crusader noble leader, a guy called Robert of Flanders, are leading some men out on a foraging mission. Remember, food is in very short supply, conditions are desperate, so they need to ride increasingly farther afield, farther away from the encirclement of Antioch, in search of stuff that they can bring back and feed people. While they were roaming, they happened to encounter the vanguard, or the initial scouts, the advance party of this Turkish army that's coming in to relieve the defenders of Antioch. And at this point, Bohemond and Robert of Flanders make a very surprising decision. So if you're out there with a few guys on a foraging expedition, this is a small group of men. They're not an army. They're not a full division of an army of any kind. They're out there looking for food. If you encounter the advance party of an incoming army, you might think that the best decision would be to turn tail, run back to your camp, alert everybody else so that they can prepare for the arrival of this massive enemy force. But that is not what Bohemond and Robert of Flanders choose to do. They decide to engage this advance party of Turkish warriors, basically to charge at them and to fight them. Although they were seriously outnumbered, they managed to coordinate their maneuvers extremely well, to stay close, to avoid being encircled, and to scatter the Turkish lines around them. And the result of this was that the Turkish advance party scattered and fled in confusion. They weren't expecting to find these guys where they did, and they definitely weren't expecting a fight. Now, as the Turkish forces begin to scatter, the knights know that now is the time to turn tail and make a quick retreat back to the army, because those Turkish guys who are scattering are going back to the rest of the army that isn't that far behind them, and if they were outnumbered before, it's going to be a very hopeless case very soon. So Bohemond, Robert of Flanders, and their foraging party head back to Antioch. And as they do this, of course, they have to leave behind the supplies that they were out there foraging. So they do lose some of their infantry, who can't run as fast as horses can ride. And they do lose some of the supplies, which were desperately needed, which we were out there to get. But they make it back to bring the word to the rest of the crusading army. Now, the commander of the Turkish army, when he hears word of this little skirmish that's just happened, is extremely surprised. The intelligence he had been given had led him to expect that the Westerners were going to be malnourished, dispirited, and basically an easy kill. He wasn't expecting to find aggressive fighters who were willing to voluntarily engage his troops. So this one skirmish seemed to run entirely opposite to all the intelligence he had received, and it made him think that everything else he'd heard about the crusading army might be similarly inaccurate. So he makes the surprising decision to turn his entire army around and march back. He doesn't proceed on to Antioch. This is not something that anybody expected, and it was the direct result of the extreme boldness, even crazy levels of valor that Bohemond and Robert of Flanders had demonstrated when they chose to go on the attack in this scenario. However, relief was short-lived. Only a few weeks later, the crusading army receives word that yet another Turkish army is on its way to Antioch to relieve the defenders of the city and engage them. Now, this was happening, by the way, because the Turkish governor of Antioch had sent word to two brothers, each of whom was a ruler in a different city. One of them was in Damascus, and the other one was in Aleppo. And so the governor of Antioch sends word to these two and says, please come and help us. We have this army outside our gates. We need assistance. But these two brothers hated each other, loathed each other. They were rivals. The older one had actually tried to kill all of his younger brothers to eliminate competition. One of those brothers had survived, and so consequently there was a high degree of animosity between the two. And so instead of uniting their forces and coming as one massive relief army, which would have been devastating to the Crusaders, they came separately. So the first brother sent his army, which was then repelled by the aggression of Bohemond and Robert of Flanders. They go back, and then the second brother decides, okay, fine, I'll send my army. So only weeks later, we have this second relief army coming towards Antioch. So Antioch is governed by a Turkish ruler, and it has a mixed population of Turks and pre-existing imperial subjects inside the city. It's surrounded by Western crusading knights, and now there's a relief army under Turkish command coming towards Antioch to engage the surrounding army. So this puts the crusading army in a really difficult position. They can't all mass together to engage this oncoming army, because then the siege will be broken, people will be coming out of Antioch, things will be getting in, all the things they've worked for in the past few months will be lost. So they have to leave troops around this massive perimeter that they've established, but they also need to send troops to engage the army that's coming. So they make the decision to send Bohemond, a few other nobles, and about 700 knights out from the perimeter to engage this army, and the rest of them remain along their positions around the city. Now, 700 men is not a lot when you're dealing with an oncoming number of thousands. So once again, we see that strategy and the element of surprise are going to be used very deliberately. Bohemond and Robert of Flanders, along with the 700 men who had been selected for this mission, rode out from the perimeter of Antioch in the dark, with the express intention of surprising the Turkish army. And the Crusader accounts from this time represent Bohemond as taking a leading role in inspiring and motivating the men on this mission. So he says, according to one account, quote, "Charge at top speed, like a brave man, and fight valiantly for God and the Holy Sepulchre, for you know in truth that this is no war of the flesh, but of the spirit. So be very brave and become a champion of Christ. Go in peace, and may the Lord be your defense. So these are words again from the Gesta Francorum, which is one of the dominant primary sources of the period, written by a crusader who was embedded, we think, with Bohemond's contingent, someone who was probably right there listening to what Bohemond was saying and watching what he did. It's not a sort of fanciful reconstruction of what he might have said by somebody writing a century later. So while we can't expect that it's word for word perfect, it is very likely to be a reasonably accurate representation. And the strategy was that part of the Crusader force would lag behind, part of the 700 knight contingent would ride forward and engage the Turks, and then at the right moment, the ones who'd been hiding in reserve would spring out and surprise the Turks who were then involved in fighting their companions and hopefully shatter the lines and cause disorder. So Bohemond himself has created this strategy. He's inspired the men who are going to ride out first. He himself hangs back with the second group because the timing of when they join the fight is going to be absolutely critical to this strategy succeeding. And again, we have our eyewitness from the Gesta Francorum who reports that when the moment came and it was time for Bohemond to take the reserve forces and engage and surprise the Turks, he says, Bohemond, protected on all sides by the sign of the cross, charged the Turkish forces like a lion which has been starving for 3 or 4 days, which comes out of its cave thirsting for the blood of cattle and falls upon the flocks, careless of its own safety, tearing the sheep as they flee hither and thither. So there's this remarkable moment when we see Bohemond very much leading from the front as he brings his guys in at the critical moment, and they succeed in their objective. They shatter the Turkish lines, there's confusion, the Turks retreat, and these knights survive. Once again, the Crusaders had secured a nearly miraculous victory against a much larger force. This relief army leaves. There's no further engagement with the Crusaders around Antioch, so it must have seemed like some sort of divine intervention to an army that was desperate, that was malnourished, and that was understandably extremely apprehensive about fighting this relief force. Bohemond had emerged as a shining inspiration to his men, and his level of military expertise was questioned by no one. But despite these two amazing victories, the situation for the crusading army still remained extremely dire, and unless something changed very soon, their luck was going to run out. The suffering now being endured by the Crusader army was felt at every level. Any finances that people had brought with them to buy food were basically exhausted, usually because as the supply of food goes down, the price people are going to pay for that food goes up. And so the cost of obtaining any kind of nourishment was increasingly exorbitant. And we see the nobles spending their money to try and buy food just to keep their men and their horses alive. There's disease, there's death, there's depression. And many of the Crusaders are beginning to conclude that if they're not experiencing success here, it must be because God is displeased with them. Instructed by the churchmen who were traveling with them, they attempted to appease God by repentance, by prayer and fasting, by throwing any prostitutes out of the camp, because they were regarded as incitement to sin, and clearly sin must be part of the reason for their extreme situation. And of course, there are going to be desertions, because in a situation as desperate as this, certain people are going to say, you know what, I've had enough. I don't need to sit out here and wait for my death by disease or starvation. I'm out. And so we see that men begin to desert. They creep away at night. They sneak out of their tents and they try to escape undetected, not being able to endure any longer the conditions that have pervaded the army for months. And one of the guys who sneaks out in the middle of the night is none other than Peter the Hermit, the traveling preacher who had inspired some 40,000 people to come from Western Europe to Constantinople, where most of them suffered death or disaster. But he himself had escaped those consequences, was still with the crusading force, and now decides that he's had enough. So, in the company of a knight and some other people, he sneaks away from the camp, and he's found and brought back in disgrace. There are accounts of these people being retrieved, dragged back, and humiliated for this desertion. So in this desperate moment, the Greek general, the imperial military officer in charge of the emperor's troops, who are accompanying the crusaders at this point, says to the crusade leaders, you know what, I'm going to leave. I'm going to go back and tell the emperor that we need provisions because the emperor's in charge of sending them. So clearly he needs to make some efforts to relieve this dire situation. So I'm going to go and let him know what's going on, and I will bring help. He even leaves his stuff in the camp as sort of a sign that he's sincere and he plans to return. But this general rides off and is never seen or heard from again. The food aid that he promised to go and obtain is also never seen. And this is important because many of the crusaders regard this moment as a kind of a betrayal, as the emperor failing to hold up his end of the deal, failing to supply their army with what they need to sustain themselves in the field, which is leading to this incredibly horrendous situation. And that's going to play a big role in the downstream effects of what happens after Antioch. So it's an important moment. The siege of Antioch drags on into the spring of 1098. So remember, they started this sometime in the middle of October. If we're now looking at the spring, we're looking at March or April. So it's been going on for some 7 months at this point. And it improves in the spring a little bit because they're able to receive some supplies by sea. Whether the emperor is in some way involved in this or not, the crusaders don't mention, but apparently they do get access to some supplies that arrive by water and are then trucked in towards Antioch. So there's a little bit of relief. They're also able to increase the tightness of their control around Antioch. So there had been some food that was able to get through the Crusader lines at various places just because you couldn't encircle all parts of the wall all the time just because of the terrain of Antioch. So there was one sort of area where there were some supplies getting into Antioch from time to time, but by the spring, the Crusaders are able to choke that off, which effectively increases the food pressure on the defenders or the inhabitants of the city. And this brings us to some of the most ghastly moments of our story. So at some point, the Crusaders had realized that their every movement and the conditions of their camp, the disease, the starvation, were being reported directly back to the governor of Antioch by spies. Why were there spies in the Crusader camp? Don't you think that would be easy to spot? Well, what had happened is when the siege began, the Turkish governor of Antioch had expelled Christian men from the city. And this wasn't a crazy idea. He thought that Antioch was so well fortified that the only thing that could make it fall was treachery from within. And so he rounded up men from the communities he thought might be sympathetic to the Crusaders, might be treacherous, and he expels them from the city. So these guys are left camping with the crusading army outside the walls of the city that had been their home up to this point. But critically, the women and children in those families are kept inside the city. And the governor of Antioch says, sorry guys, I have to kick you out. Don't worry, I'll take care of your wives and children, but you're going to have to leave that to me until this siege is over. So this means there's a large number of former inhabitants of Antioch, mostly Christian, from different ethnic backgrounds, who are already embedded with the crusading army. Some of these people are transferring information about the crusading army back into Antioch. So it's not hard to see why some of these men would be motivated to pass intelligence back into Antioch. In some ways, it's a way of saying, please don't hurt my wife and kids. I'm on your side. And also, if and when these crazy foreigners leave, remember that we were also peaceful residents of the city and we'd like to go back to our homes and continue living as we have. So it's sort of an insurance policy for men caught between these two forces in a really desperate situation. But the Crusaders, when they realize that this is going on and that the governor of Antioch is receiving detailed reports of every problem that they're having, they decide they have to put a stop to this. So there's one account that reports that the Crusaders capture a man they think is a spy. They kill him. They put his body on a spit. They roast it over a fire, and then they begin eating parts of his flesh, loudly proclaiming that this is the fate that will await anyone else who's thought to be a spy. So at this point, as you can imagine, many of these guys who've been kicked out of Antioch are desperate to leave the Crusader camp altogether because no one wants to suffer a fate such as this. And of course, this killing and eating, it's being done in the view of people who are in the camp, but people inside the city would definitely have been made aware of it as well. But as often happens in these situations, when things begin to get ugly, they get uglier because the other side is going to retaliate. And that's exactly what we see. The Turks had already captured a number of crusaders, the Turks inside Antioch. And you might be wondering how? Well, in all these months that the crusading army is sitting around the city, there are going to be times when parties of Turkish defenders will ride out of one of the gates. They will engage the crusaders at that particular location. They'll have a skirmish, and then they'll retreat back into the city walls. And when they do that retreat, they'll seize anyone they've managed to cut off from the rest of the crusader lines and to isolate, and they'll grab that person and take them back into Antioch. So that's now a prisoner. So in this fashion, the Turkish defenders had captured a number of knights. And one of these guys is a knight called Reynaud Porcher. So the governor of Antioch, whose name is Yari Sidan, takes Reynaud Porcher, he puts him on top of the 20-foot wall, and he says, okay, you need to negotiate with your companions in your crusading army the terms of your ransom. You better get them to agree to pay me a certain amount of money in exchange for your life. So ransom is a thing that we see happening all the time in the Middle Ages. You would capture hopefully higher ranking nobles or princes, and you would hold them for ransom so that their side would have to offer you a high price, which they would pay you in exchange for you handing over that captive to them. So this is the deal that Yari Sedan is trying to extract. He says to Reynaud, you negotiate the terms for your life. You get them to agree to pay me a certain amount of money, and then I'll let you go. Reynaud Porcher declines. He says, no, I'm not going to plead for my life. I'm not going to engage and beg these people in my army to pay money for my life. I won't do it. So this infuriates Yari Sedan, who's now been officially defied, and so he then tries to extract something else. He says, okay, well, you have to renounce Christianity and embrace Islam. Like, I need some victory over you now that you've called my authority out in public. And Reynaud, he refuses this as well. So he ends up being killed by decapitation as he's kneeling in prayer. And of course, this would be done as much as possible in view of the crusading army outside the wall. It's unclear if the decapitation itself was something that they could see, but even if it wasn't, they would very quickly have held up that head and made sure that everyone knew what happened to Reynaud Porcher. But what came next was even worse. Yari Sedan, the governor of Antioch, then orders that any other remaining Western prisoners he has, a handful of knights, be brought to where he is, and he has them stripped naked and tied up with their hands behind their backs. He then has them tied together in a circle, and he has his men pile hay and firewood and other flammable materials around them, and without further ado, he sets them on fire. So he burns these men alive, and the sounds of their shrieks and their screams would have been audible to everybody. And this, of course, was the entire point, that the Crusader army be made to hear and to know what had happened to their comrades. So why? We have to ask, why would the governor of Antioch do such a sickening thing? He must have thought, first of all, that these men didn't have any more value as negotiating chips. He must have thought if Reynaud was going to refuse, that he couldn't extract any sort of monetary benefit for these men, so they didn't have any bargaining benefit for him anymore. Or perhaps he thought that these men were more valuable to him dead than they were alive. This is because there were members of the Turkish defense force inside Antioch who, by this point, in May of 1098, already wanted to surrender. They were tired of the siege. They thought that they should make a deal with the crusading army and finish this. So he was aware that there were sections of the military force that he depended on to secure the city who already wanted this to be over with. If his own men were wavering, then committing a sickening act such as this would ensure that every member of the crusading army would be hell-bent on slaughtering every single Turk they could get their hands on if and when they broke into the city. And that meant that there could be no talk of surrender. Any Turkish soldier at that point would have to know that he would be fighting to the death, because if he surrendered, he would be offered absolutely no mercy, no terms. Perhaps this ghastly action was designed to ensure that surrender and negotiation were not options for anybody. So Yaghi Sedan didn't invent this dynamic. This tactic has been used by other military forces at other places and other times, most recently perhaps by the Japanese in World War II. Japanese soldiers were encouraged, or indeed required, to torture and murder in horrendous ways Americans in their hands, Americans that they had as captives. And often we have reports of them doing this in trenches within hearing distance of Americans who were listening to their comrades die in these horrendous ways at Japanese hands. And the purpose of this was to ensure that for the Japanese, there could be no surrender. Having performed such acts on American captives, they would have to be under no illusions that if they were to surrender, they could expect exactly the same thing. And so these types of horrifying actions have been used as a way to stiffen the spine of the soldiers on the side that does it. Because even if they didn't themselves personally participate, they know that the army that witnesses this will have no quarter for anybody on their side. The city of Antioch, however, was soon to fall to the Crusaders, and the method would be treachery. So it was an armor maker who manned one of the defensive towers that was on the city of Antioch's perimeter wall, who was corrupted by Bohemond. Other reports say that this armor maker had an axe to grind with Yaghi Sedan, who had penalized him for some illicit trading or something. But in any case, he was alienated from the governor of Antioch, and he was bribed by promises of wealth and honor by Bohemond on the Crusader side. So this guy is going to be a traitor who's going to let the Crusaders in. He's made this agreement with Bohemond. But after successfully securing this deal, Bohemond doesn't tell anybody about it just yet. With this ace up his sleeve to use whenever it suited him, Bohemond's personal ambitions now became obvious. He called a meeting with the other nobles who were in charge of the divisions of the Crusader army, and he said, "Let's make a deal. Let's attack Antioch, and whoever breaches the wall first, whoever takes the city, it shall be his." Of course, Bohemond already knows that he's going to be the first one to get in, but nobody else knows this. They don't know that he has an insider advantage. So they're just listening to this proposal, and they refuse. The Crusaders refuse, saying, "We all have an equal right to the city. It doesn't belong to any one of us. And besides, we're going to have to surrender it back to the emperor anyway at some point, because that's what our oaths require us to do." However, news soon arrived that would change their calculations. The crusading army received word that yet another, a third, massive Muslim army was on its way to relieve the siege at Antioch. So now they're in a really difficult situation. They're trapped between the defenders inside the wall and the attackers who are going to come in and surround them as they are outside the walls of Antioch. So the whole army will be spread out and trapped. It's a very bad situation to be in. They need to take the city as quickly as they can, if it's at all possible, to avoid being caught in this configuration when that army arrives. This new sense of urgency directed the next emergency meeting among Bohemond and the other Crusader leaders, and they now said to him, "Okay, Bohemond, if you can take the city, it will be yours. unless the emperor sends help or reinforcements to us, in which case we have to surrender it to him when the time comes, as we've already agreed by oath. With this agreement secured, Bohemond then put his secret plan into action on the night of June the 3rd, 1098. The traitor would signal to Bohemond and his men from the tower at the right moment when the other men patrolling that watch had moved aside. The traitor was going to lower a ladder, and this was going to be connected to another series of ropes by Bohemond and his men, and they were going to send an advance party up those ropes and into the defensive tower. Now, this is a very critical moment because while there's one guy working on the inside, this armor maker who's going to signal to them and let down the rope, none of the other men on that tower wall are in on this. The other members of the watch, the other Turkish soldiers who are defending this section of the wall, don't know anything about this plan. So it's absolutely essential that Bohemond get some of his men up and into that tower before they're spotted and the alarm is raised. Because if word gets out on the wall that some of them have gotten in, they're going to be slaughtered and thrown over the wall very quickly, and the entire plan will have failed. So they choose a party of 60 men who are going to be the first to go up this ladder. And the reports from this moment indicate that these guys are terrified. And when you think about it for half a minute, you can understand why. They don't know that this armor maker who's supposedly helping them is actually on their side. This entire thing could be a trap to secure a fresh bunch of Western hostages for some increasingly gory and horrifying deaths. Or even if the armor maker is on their side, they might have the incredible bad luck of being spotted by a returning patrol or other men in the tower and then overwhelmed and cut to pieces. So you have to imagine that these guys are absolutely terrified as they're beginning to climb the ladder in the dark up toward the light in the tower, hoping that they're going to survive this mission. Once they get inside, if they manage to start cutting down members of the watch and patrols before they're spotted, then Bohemond and the rest of the force outside this tower are going to break in to the gate at the bottom and begin to come in larger numbers. So that's the plan. The first 60 men do scale the ladder into the tower. There's some problem with a few of them falling off or dying on the way up because there are too many men on the ropes and it's too heavy. So they don't all survive, but enough of them make it up into the tower that they're able to surprise, overpower, and kill other Turkish defenders on the wall, and Bohemond and the rest of them at the bottom can force open the gate and begin flooding into the city. So as soon as Bohemond and the main body of his troops get access through the gate of this tower and start flooding into this part of the city, they sound their trumpets. And they do this to signal to the crusading armies at other parts of the wall that now is the time for them to begin their assault on their gates. This done, Bohemond puts his own banner up visibly on the wall, and he does this to assert that he was first inside the city and that it belongs to him. But then he and his men also began yelling at the top of their lungs, Deus vult, which means God wills it, and generally making as much noise as they can while they're fighting their way through because they want it to appear chaotic. They want it to appear that suddenly the entire city is under attack from all directions, there are attackers inside the city, and to make it seem as though there are more of them than there actually are. So you have to imagine what happens to the people in Antioch as the darkness begins to give way to early morning, and suddenly they hear the clamor of voices, the clanging of swords. There are men inside the walls. There's a crusader banner, but they're also under attack from many other parts of the city. It was overwhelming, and it caused exactly the effect they were hoping for. People began to panic. They thought the city was already overrun, which it wasn't. But the belief that it was made that a reality very quickly. Even the governor of Antioch himself, Yagisidan, thinks that's it, they're already inside, the day is lost, and he flees out of one of the gates with some of his men. He absolutely abandons the city in this panicked desertion. At this point, the Turkish resistance inside the city collapses, crusaders begin to pour in from all the gates, and now the sack and massacre of the city begins. While the crusaders' targets were Muslim Turks, who had control of the city, in the fighting, in the early morning, they were basically killing anyone they found. And so a large number of Syrian, Greek, and Armenian Christians who lived inside the city also died in the general slaughter and raping and theft that then ensued as the sack of Antioch proceeded. So the Crusaders had finally taken Antioch after 8 months of siege. But they didn't have long to enjoy this victory. First of all, they found very little food inside the city, and that was partly because their own siege around the walls had ensured a steadily dwindling supply. So if they were hoping that they would have some relief from their desperate hunger conditions, they didn't find much. And the very next day, they found that the vanguard of the next Turkish relief army was beginning to arrive outside the walls. So in a sudden reversal of fortune, the besiegers were about to become the besieged. They had gone from being the army around the city walls to being the people trapped inside who were going to be surrounded now by a different Turkish army that had them trapped inside. In the next couple of days, the Turkish army arrives in its entirety. They surround the entire city, and then they subject the Crusaders inside to a 48-hour all-out assault. And this is possible because the Turks have the advantage of massive numbers, so they can send men in shifts. All right, you're going to assault here for these 4 hours, then you fall back, then we send a new division to continue. And so they're able to work in shorter units of time. But for the Crusaders on the inside, they're on high alert for 48 hours. And we have reports from that time saying that even if you had any food or water, you didn't have a moment to consume it. For 48 hours, it was absolutely all hands on deck, full panic mode, extreme levels of fighting for the defenders of Antioch. Now, the Turks didn't maintain this continuous assault after the 48 hours. They settled down and they began to wait because they knew the Crusaders had nowhere to go. They had no food, nowhere to forage for food because now they were stuck inside the walls. And so the Turks had the assurance that they wouldn't have to wait months to win this one. They weren't going to have to wait very long at all before hunger would do the job that the assault hadn't completed yet. In all of the 8 months of suffering that the siege of Antioch entailed, with the many desperate experiences and dark hours that the Crusaders have endured, this is perhaps the very darkest of them all. They are surrounded by a much larger force, they have no food, and there seems to be no way out. Are they going to survive? Will they be massacred in large numbers? Will any of them ever make it to Jerusalem? To find out, you'll have to come back for episode 3 of the First Crusade. But if you've enjoyed this one, please make sure that you're subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss the finale of this epic expedition or any of the other amazing history stories that are coming your way on Villains and Virgins podcast. And if you've really enjoyed it, please consider heading over to patreon.com/Eva Schubert, where you can support the podcast and ensure that many more stories like this are delivered to you. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.